by the time the controversy surrounding offshore gaming operations began. To dominate headlines, the country had already moved through several years of overlapping national issues: pandemic recovery, healthcare system investigations, infrastructure debates, and questions about foreign-linked operations within the country. Each had briefly occupied the center of public attention, and each had eventually given way to the next. Then, another issue entered the national conversation, not through disaster, not through security operations, but through the national budget, a line item, a category of government spending that, by design, is not publicly detailed. Confidential funds. Confidential funds are not new in the Philippine government. Certain offices have long been allowed to allocate resources for sensitive activities that require discretion. Intelligence gathering, security operations, situations where public disclosure could compromise effectiveness. But when one particular allocation appeared in the national budget, it quickly drew attention. The discussion was not simply about the existence of these funds. It was about where they were placed, how they would be used, and whether the allocation aligned with the responsibilities of the office receiving them. As lawmakers and analysts examined the figures, the issue began to grow beyond a budgetary detail. It became a national debate. Questions were raised in hearings. Statements were issued. Explanations were offered. And for a time, the country's attention focused on a familiar theme, once again: how public funds are allocated, and how institutions respond when those decisions are questioned. These funds are commonly associated with security and intelligence work. For example, agencies involved in national security, law enforcement, and intelligence gathering may require operational spending that cannot be publicly itemized. In such cases, detailed reporting is restricted to protect sources, methods, or ongoing operations. Historically, confidential or intelligence funds have been allocated to several offices. These have included the Office of the President, law enforcement agencies, and departments responsible for national security. In these contexts, the funds are intended to support intelligence activities, surveillance operations, or security coordination. It is also important to distinguish confidential funds from something else that once dominated national debate: the Priority Development Assistance Fund, more widely known as the pork barrel. PDAF allowed legislators to allocate public funds to local development projects within their districts. These were infrastructure projects, scholarships, and community programs. Confidential funds operate differently. They are not discretionary development funds. They are operational funds meant for sensitive activities. Because of their nature, confidential funds are subject to a different form of oversight. Instead of public project lists, they are typically audited through restricted reporting procedures. This system is designed to balance two goals: operational secrecy and accountability for public funds. For many years, this arrangement existed with relatively little public attention, until one particular allocation placed the concept of confidential funds directly into the national conversation. And when that happened, the debate was no longer about the existence of the fund. It was about how it was being used. The discussion surrounding confidential funds entered the national spotlight during the review of the national budget, as lawmakers examined the proposed allocations. Attention focused on the confidential funds, assigned to the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Education. The amounts themselves were not unprecedented within the broader national budget, but the placement of those funds within these offices raised questions that lawmakers began to examine more closely. The issue was not simply the presence of confidential funds, it was the context in which they appeared. Traditionally, confidential or intelligence funds were associated with agencies involved in national security and law enforcement. But in this case, the funds had been allocated to offices whose primary mandates were not typically linked to intelligence operations. That difference became the center of the debate. During congressional hearings, lawmakers asked how the funds would be used. Officials explained that the allocation was intended to support programs related to security concerns, including efforts to address threats that could affect educational institutions and government operations. The explanations were placed on record, but the questions did not end there. Some legislators and policy observers argued that clearer guidelines were necessary. Others emphasized that the use of confidential funds had long been part of government operations. The discussion gradually expanded beyond a single budget line. It became a broader conversation about transparency, oversight, and how discretionary security funds should be managed. For several weeks, the issue dominated national coverage. Budget hearings were broadcast. Statements from both supporters and critics circulated widely. And once again, the country found itself debating a familiar question: how public funds should be used, and how the institutions responsible for those funds should be held accountable. As the debate intensified, congressional committees began conducting formal reviews of the allocation. Lawmakers requested explanations regarding how confidential funds were authorized, how they would be used, and what safeguards existed to ensure accountability. Budget hearings became the central venue where these questions were addressed. Officials from the concerned offices appeared before legislators to respond to inquiries and clarify the purpose of the funds. Oversight mechanisms were also discussed. In the Philippine system, confidential and intelligence funds are subject to auditing procedures, although the detailed documentation may be restricted due to the nature of the operations they support. These reviews are typically conducted through internal government processes, rather than public disclosure. The intention is to balance two competing principles: operational confidentiality and financial accountability. Outside the hearing rooms, the issue continued to unfold in public debate. Policy analysts, lawmakers, and commentators offered differing interpretations of the situation. Some argued that the controversy highlighted the need for clearer guidelines on how confidential funds should be allocated. Others maintained that the existing framework already allowed such allocations within the authority of the executive branch. At its core, the discussion reflected a long-standing tension in governance. Transparency requires openness. Security sometimes requires discretion. Confidential funds exist at the intersection of those two principles, and because of that, debates about their use often extend beyond the numbers themselves. For a time, the controversy remained one of the most discussed political issues in the country. Hearings continued, statements were issued, questions circulated across both traditional media and online platforms. But as with many national controversies, the rhythm of public attention would eventually begin to shift again. For several weeks, the discussion around confidential funds remained at the center of national attention. Congressional hearings continued. Public statements were issued. Media coverage followed the developments closely. But over time, the intensity of that attention began to change. Not because the issue had reached a clear conclusion, but because the national conversation had started to move elsewhere. This shift is not unusual. News cycles operate on momentum. When one issue dominates public discourse, it holds the spotlight for a time. Then gradually, another development begins to emerge. A different story, a different controversy, a different national conversation. Inside government institutions, the formal processes surrounding the issue continued. Budget oversight procedures remained active. Administrative reviews moved forward. Officials continued performing their responsibilities. But outside those institutional channels, the public focus had already begun to drift. This is one of the defining patterns of modern political discourse. Issues rarely end in a single moment. They transition. The spotlight moves forward. While earlier debates continue quietly in the background, the controversy surrounding confidential funds did not disappear. But the national conversation surrounding it became less immediate, less constant, and eventually less visible. Because once again, another issue was beginning to capture the country's attention. When the national conversation moves on, the underlying processes rarely stop. Oversight mechanisms continue. Administrative reviews proceed. Policies evolve through committees, reports, and institutional channels. These developments rarely appear as headlines, but they are where many issues ultimately continue to unfold. Confidential funds remain part of the national budget. The debates surrounding their allocation have contributed to ongoing discussions about oversight and transparency. Lawmakers continue to examine how these funds should be governed. Agencies continue to operate under the existing legal framework. In this sense, the issue did not simply disappear. It became part of a longer institutional conversation. Looking back across the past decade, a pattern becomes visible. Each major issue arrives with urgency. Public attention gathers around it. Investigations begin. Debates unfold. And then, gradually, another issue emerges. The spotlight shifts. The conversation changes. But the earlier questions often remain part of the institutional landscape. This series does not attempt to resolve those questions. Its purpose is simpler: to remember where the headlines once pointed, and to ask what happens after the attention fades. Because, in the space after the headlines, the real story often continues.